The land and its people. There are places on this earth where the ground remembers everything. Where the soil beneath your feet carries the memory of every war ever fought on it, every celebration ever danced on it, every drop of blood ever spilled into it, every tear ever wept into it, every prayer ever whispered over it at the edge of dawn when the world is still quiet and the ancestors feel close enough to touch. The village of Ayacho is one of those places. It sits in a valley cradled by hills that turn a deep purple at sunset, surrounded on three sides by forests so old and so thick that the people who live here have long since stopped trying to understand everything that lives inside it. They respect it instead. They leave offerings at its edge. They teach their children to walk carefully when the path leads into its shadows, and to always, always, speak respectfully of what cannot be seen. The river on the fourth side is called Omi. It runs clear and cold from somewhere deep in the hills and empties itself into the lowlands beyond the village boundary. The women of Ayacho have drawn water from Omi for as many generations as anyone can count. Children learn to swim in its shallow edges. Old men sit on its banks in the evenings and talk about the things that matter when the business of the day is finished. Ayacho is not the largest village in this part of the land, but it is one of the most proud. Pride here is not arrogance, it is the quiet confidence of a people who have survived things that should have broken them and emerged each time with their identity intact. They have survived wars with neighboring communities. They have survived seasons when the rain refused to fall and the earth cracked open with thirst. They have survived pestilence, loss, grief, and the kind of internal conflict that tears communities apart from the inside. They have survived because of their structure. Because of their kin. Because of their customs. Because of the web of traditions that holds every individual life in its proper place and connects each person to every other person in ways both visible and invisible. In Ayacho, the traditions are not suggestions. They are the architecture of life itself. The framework within which every important decision is made, every important moment is marked, every important transition is honored. Birth is surrounded by ritual. Adulthood is marked with ceremony. Marriage is a sacred declaration, public, witnessed, binding, made before the community and before the ancestors. And death, when it comes, is met with the full dignity of a people who understand that the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than most are willing to admit. This is the word of our story. Hold it in your mind as we begin. Because everything that happens in the pages that follow can only be fully understood if you understand the world it happens inside. Now, let us meet the people. The king. His name is Uloko. He has been king of Ayacho for 31 years. Long enough that most of the adults in the village have never known any other king. Long enough that his voice, his manner, his way of holding his body in public have become part of the community's definition of what authority looks and feels like. Uloko is not a large man physically. He was never the tallest or the broadest. In his youth he was a respectable fighter but not the most fearsome. He was a decent farmer but not the most productive. He was a competent hunter but not the most skilled. What Uloko had, what he had always had even as a young man, even before the kingship found him, was judgment. The rare, almost supernatural ability to sit inside a complicated situation and find the thread of truth running through it. To hear 10 different people telling 10 different versions of the same story and identify, with a precision that seemed impossible, where the actual truth lived and what it demanded. This is the gift that made him king. Not strength. Not lineage alone. But the gift of judgment. The gift of knowing what to do when knowing what to do is the hardest thing in the world. In 31 years of ruling Ayacho he has settled land disputes that had lasted for generations. He has brokered peace between families that had been enemies since before anyone living could remember the original cause. He has navigated the delicate politics of relationships with neighboring communities with a patience and a wisdom that has kept Ayacho safe during times when other villages were bleeding. He has 2 wives. Several children. Grandchildren now beginning to show the first signs of the personalities they will carry through life. He has buried a son. That grief changed him in ways he has never fully articulated, made him quieter in certain moments, softer around the edges in others, harder in the places that needed to be hard. He sits on his throne each morning and receives his people. He listens more than he speaks. He asks questions more than he gives answers. He has learned over 31 years that the answer you reach yourself is always stronger than the answer someone gives you, and so he governs by asking questions that lead people to their own understanding rather than simply issuing commands. But when the moment demands a command, when the situation requires the full weight of royal authority to be brought down with clarity and finality, Uloko does not hesitate. He is the kind of king his people have been fortunate to have. They know this. Not all of them say it out loud. But they know it. And on the day that the gun speaks twice, on the day that a situation arises for which no tradition has prepared him and no wisdom he has accumulated across 31 years of ruling has a ready answer, it will be Uloko who must find the path through. He does not know this yet. This morning he is simply sitting in his compound drinking palm wine and watching a lizard navigate the wall opposite him with the focused curiosity of a man who has learned that wisdom hides in small things. But the day is coming. And when it arrives, everything will depend on him. AGBA. Say his name slowly. AGBA. Let it sit in your mouth for a moment before you release it. Because names in Ayacho are not accidents. They are prophecies spoken before the child can understand language, carved into the child's identity before the child has had any chance to shape their own. Agba means warrior. Not warrior like a title. Not warrior like a job description. Warrior like a condition of being. Like something written into the bones before the bones are fully formed. He was born during a storm. The kind of storm that makes old people go inside and close their doors and speak quietly to whatever protective forces they trust to keep the lightning from finding them. The kind of storm that bends the tree sideways and turns the river loud and wild. His mother labored through the worst of it. The midwives walked by the light of oil lamps that the wind kept threatening to extinguish. And when Agba finally arrived, when he came into the world after a labor that had been longer and harder than any of them had expected, he did not cry the thin, uncertain cry of a newborn finding its first breath. He screamed. A sound so full, so immediate, so completely unafraid of its own volume that the midwife who caught him actually startled and stepped back for a moment. She had helped bring hundreds of children into the world. She had never heard a newborn announce itself like that. His father, waiting outside with the other men, heard the cry through the storm. He looked at the sky, at the lightning splitting the darkness above them, and he felt something in his chest that he later described as recognition. Like the storm had been waiting for this child. Like the child and the storm were made of the same material and were simply meeting each other for the first time. He named him Agba that night. And Agba grew into his name with a completeness that made people who knew the tradition of naming in Uloko nod with quiet satisfaction. As if everything had gone exactly as it should. He was strong from childhood in the way that some children simply are, not because they trained harder or were fed better but because their body has a different relationship with strength than most bodies do. He was faster than his age mates in a way that remained consistent year after year regardless of how much they grew and trained. He hit harder. He absorbed more. He recovered faster. But beyond the physical, and this is what separated Agba from simply being a large, strong young man, he had the instinct. Warriors who survive long enough to become legends will tell you that physical ability is not what keeps you alive on a battlefield. Physical ability gets you through the door. What keeps you alive is instinct, the ability to process the situation faster than conscious thought allows, to move before your mind has finished forming the instruction, to know where the danger is coming from before your eyes have confirmed it. Agba had this from the beginning. He trained under the village's warrior elders from the age of 9. They recognized what they were working with immediately and they did not treat it casually. They pushed him. They challenged him in ways that would have broken less gifted students. They gave him opponents he could not easily defeat, because they understood that a warrior who has never struggled learns nothing about the thing that matters most. How to survive when the advantage is against you. By the time Akbar was a young man, by the time the storm that birthed him had been replaced by the storms he was now capable of walking through himself, he was recognized throughout Ayacho and in several neighboring communities as something unusual. A fighter of rare gifts. A warrior born for exactly what the word on his name claimed he was. He was not a cruel man. This is important to understand. Great warriors are often assumed to be hard in all directions, hard toward enemies, hard toward their own people, hard in the private moments of life. Akbar was not this. He was gentle with children and with elders. He was patient with people who were slower than him in every dimension, which was most people. He laughed easily. He told stories well. He sat comfortably in the company of both men and women. But when a situation required the warrior to step forward, when the moment called for the thing he was built to be, there was a quality that came over Akbar that people who witnessed it found difficult to describe afterward. A settling into himself. A quieting. Like a river that runs fast and wide in ordinary time, suddenly finding a channel that focuses all of its energy into a single, powerful, precise flow. He had never been married. At the age at which most men in Ayacho had already taken a wife and begun building their household, Akbar had not. Not because women were not interested, they were. Not because his family had not tried to arrange something, they had. But Akbar had a stubbornness, buried under all that patience and gentleness, about this particular thing. He would not be married to someone he had not chosen with his own heart. And his heart, until recently, had not chosen anyone. Until Inori Ojika. He came into the world quietly. This is how everyone who was present at his birth describes it, and it is the detail that becomes most significant in retrospect. No storm. No drama. A clear night, a full moon, a labor that was shorter than expected and smoother than most. He arrived in the early hours when the village was its most still and even the dogs that normally narrated the night with their ongoing conversations had gone silent. The midwife placed him in his mother's arms and he looked up with eyes that seemed, and this is the word people use, even now, even understanding how strange it sounds when applied to a newborn, curious. Not afraid. Not overwhelmed. Curious. As if he had arrived somewhere he had been wanting to visit for a long time and was already beginning to take it in. His father named him Ojika. It means one who sees beyond what is visible. One who hears what others miss. One who lives in the space between the ordinary world and the world that exists just underneath it. Ojika grew up in a household full of sound. His father was a drummer, not the chief drummer of the village but a man who played with a love for rhythm that transformed every piece of wood or skin stretched over hollow into something that spoke. His mother sang. Not professionally. Not ceremonially. But constantly, while she cooked, while she walked, while she moved through the ordinary business of her day. Their household had a quality of constant music to it that the other houses on their compound could hear at almost any hour. Ojika absorbed all of it. He began playing the flute when he was 6 years old. His father carved him a small one from a piece of bamboo and showed him the basic fingering, expecting the interest to last a few weeks before some other boyhood fascination replaced it. Instead, Ojika sat with that flute for hours. Days. Weeks. Coming inside from play earlier than the other children, sitting in the corner of the room his mother used for cooking where the warmth gathered, and playing. And playing. And playing. By the time he was 10, the sound coming from that corner of the house was no longer a child learning an instrument. It was a conversation between Ojika and something that lived inside the music. The notes he found were not just technically correct, they carried feeling. They carried story. You could close your eyes and listen to Ojika play and find yourself somewhere else. Not just anywhere, somewhere specific. Somewhere with a temperature and a quality of light and an emotional atmosphere that you could almost touch. The village began to notice. By the time Ojika was a young man, he was sought for every important celebration, every ceremony, every gathering that required music to carry people from the ordinary into the extraordinary. His flute was present at naming ceremonies and at funerals. At the beginnings of things and the ends of things. At the festivals where the community needed to remember together who they were and where they had come from. He played at the edge of the sacred. This is the only way to describe it accurately. There are musicians who entertain and there are musicians who open something. Ojika opened something. People who were carrying grief they had not been able to release would find themselves weeping when he played, not with pain but with relief, as if the music had found the locked place and turned the key. People who had forgotten what joy felt like in its purest form would feel it return somewhere behind the chest when Ojika's flute found the right phrase. He was not a warrior. This needs to be stated clearly, not as criticism but as fact. Ojika had not trained with the warrior elders. He had not spent his years learning to absorb punishment and deliver it. He was lean where Agba was broad. He was quiet where Agba was present. He moved through the world with a quality of stillness that was the opposite of the coiled readiness that Agba carried everywhere. But Ojika was not weak. Do not make that mistake. There is a kind of strength that is built from knowing who you are completely, from being so settled in your own identity, so comfortable in your own way of moving through the world, that the pressure other people's expectations exert on you finds no purchase. Nothing to grip. Ojika had this strength in abundance. He knew he was not a warrior. He also knew that this was not a deficiency. He was something else, something equally necessary to the life of a community, something that Ayacho would be genuinely poorer without. The warrior protects the body of the village. The musician protects the soul of it. Both are necessary. Neither is more important than the other. Ojika knew this. And he walked through Ayacho with the quiet confidence of a man who understood his own value without needing anyone to confirm it for him. He had not been married either. For reasons less deliberate than Agba's, Ojika had simply been so absorbed in his music, so completely occupied by the world that existed inside and around the sounds he made, that the ordinary rhythms of courtship and arrangement had somehow always happened just at the edge of his attention without fully capturing it. Until Inori. Because Inori had heard him play. And she had wept. And he had seen her weeping. And in that moment of witnessing another human being moved so completely by something he had made, something had shifted in Ojika that had not shifted before. He began to notice her. And noticing her, he began to understand why. Inori. Let us take our time here. Let us sit with Inori the way you sit with someone whose presence demands that you stop rushing and simply be present with them. Her name means prayer. Petition. The word sent upward from a human heart towards something greater than itself in the hope of being heard. And she carries the name not with the weight of obligation but with the ease of someone for whom the meaning is simply true. Inori is the only daughter of Erema, a woman of considerable standing in Ayacho whose family had been part of this community for as many generations as the trees that grow at the edge of the village market. Looking for the principles that govern how she moves through difficulty without losing her center. Inori inherited something from her mother. She received her directness, the quality of looking at something and naming it honestly without dressing it in language it does not deserve. From her mother she received the grace. The ability to be completely honest and completely kind at the same time, which is a rarer combination than most people realize. She was not raised to be beautiful. This is a distinction worth making. Some women are raised with their beauty as the central fact of their existence, the thing their family treats as their primary currency, their most important quality, the attribute around which all other considerations revolve. Inori was not raised this way. She was raised to be capable. To grind her own pepper and manage a household and negotiate fairly in the market and know her own mind well enough to speak it when speaking it mattered. The beauty was simply there, consistent and undemanding, like good weather. It did not require her attention. It existed whether she tended to it or not. People noticed it the way people notice a river that runs clear, with appreciation that does not become obsession because the river itself is too busy being what it is to invite obsession. What people noticed more, if they were paying attention, was her intelligence. Inori thought carefully before she spoke. Not with the careful hesitation of someone who lacks confidence, but with the deliberate patience of someone who understands that words, once released, cannot be recalled, and so they deserve to be chosen with accuracy. When she did speak, the things she said tended to land with the weight of something true. People found themselves nodding before they had consciously decided to agree, because she had a way of articulating things that they had been feeling without having words for. She was not naive about her situation. She was of marriageable age in a community where that was a fact that everyone around you tracked even when you were not tracking it yourself. She knew that conversations about her future were happening in compounds she did not have access to. She knew that men had been looking. She knew that the system within which she lived would eventually present her with an outcome that she would be expected to accept with the grace her mother had modeled and her father expected. She had made her peace with most of this. What she had not made her peace with was the possibility of being given to someone who did not see her. Not her face, anyone with eyes could see that. But her. The part that thought carefully and spoke precisely and wept at music and could hold a difficult conversation without either running from it or escalating it unnecessarily. The part that got up before dawn sometimes and sat with the river and asked it questions she could not ask anyone else. She wanted to be seen by whoever she spent her life with. Fully seen. And she suspected, in the quiet space where she was most honest with herself, that she had some sense of who in Ayachu was capable of that seeing. But she had not spoken this preference out loud to anyone. Because speaking it out loud, in this world, in this tradition, would change nothing about what was going to happen. The tradition would proceed as the tradition always proceeded. And she would receive its outcome with the grace that was expected of her. She had not counted on the gun speaking twice. Nobody had. The season of looking. In the months before the festival, Iloko hummed with the particular energy of a community in which something important is building. Agba had been looking at Inori. Everyone had noticed. Not because he was obvious about it, Agba was not a man who announced his inner states to the world without choosing to. But because in a village of this size, where everyone knows everyone and has known everyone for their entire lives, the quality of a person's attention toward another person is visible even when it is not meant to be. He watched her in the market with a steadiness that was not the restless looking of desire but the focused attention of someone trying to understand something important. He watched the way she moved through negotiation, the patience, the fairness, the quiet firmness when she encountered someone who tried to take advantage of her. He watched the way she was with children, the ease of it, the naturalness, the way they came to her without being invited as if they understood instinctively that she was safe. He said nothing to her directly. This was the custom. A man in Ayachu did not approach the woman he intended to marry and announce himself to her. He prepared himself. He prepared his family. He prepared the gift and the moment and the declaration. But he watched. And watching, he became increasingly certain. Ojika had been looking at Inori differently. Where Agba's attention was steady and focused, Ojika's was almost involuntary, the way you keep looking at the source of light in a room even when you are trying to pay attention to something else. He had not planned to notice her. But having noticed, he could not stop. He had first truly seen her at a naming ceremony 3 months before the festival. He was playing, as he often was, the flute, moving through a series of phrases that were meant to welcome the new child into the community, to introduce them to the spirit of the people they were joining. And he had looked up from his playing, which he did sometimes, not to seek an audience but because the music occasionally directed his attention outward, and he had seen Inori standing with the other women, weeping. Not sobbing. Not making a scene. but with tears running down her face in that clean, quiet way that means the emotion has found a genuine path out rather than being performed for anyone watching. She was moved. Completely, honestly moved by what she was hearing. No one had ever wept at his music before in a way that he actually witnessed at the precise moment of it happening. People told him afterward. People described it after the fact. But he had never looked up from his instrument and caught someone in the exact instant that the music reached them. He held the image of her face in that moment for the rest of the ceremony. Through all the subsequent songs. Through the eating and the celebration and the walk back to his compound through the evening air. He held it for weeks after. And when he finally admitted to himself what it meant that he was holding it, what it meant that the thought of her face at that moment was the first thing that arrived in his mind when he woke in the morning and the last thing that settled there before sleep, he understood that something had changed in him that could not be changed back. Neither man knew about the other. This is the cruelty of the situation in its earliest form, not malicious cruelty, not the cruelty of betrayal, but the simple cruelty of coincidence. Of two hearts moving toward the same destination without any awareness that they were traveling the same road. And Inori. Inori knew that she was being watched. A woman of her perceptiveness, in a community of this size, always knows. She felt Agba's attention before she identified it, felt it as a quality of weight in the air when he was near, a kind of density that arrived before the man himself did. She felt Ojika's differently, felt it as something that occasionally caught her from unexpected angles, the way a particular quality of light sometimes reaches you from a direction you were not looking. She had not allowed herself to fully examine what she felt in response to either. Because examining it would make it more real. And making it more real, in the tradition she lived inside, was a luxury she was not confident she had. So she went to the market. She ground her pepper. She helped her mother. She sat with the river before dawn and asked it questions. And she waited, the way women in traditions like hers have always waited, for the world outside her to make its next move. It made it at the festival. The festival. The Ayacho Harvest Festival came at the end of the season when the work of the year had been completed and the community needed to gather itself, to look at what had been accomplished, to thank whatever forces had made it possible, to celebrate the fact of its own continued existence with the full-throated joy of a people who understand that continued existence is never something to take for granted. Preparations began 3 days before. The women organized the food, a collective effort that turned individual households into contributing parts of a communal feast of extraordinary scale. The men prepared the grounds, clearing, sweeping, setting up the spaces where specific ceremonies would occur. The drummers tuned their instruments and began the warm-up rhythms that gradually built across those 3 days from background presence into the full insistence of celebration. Ojika spent those 3 days in a state of heightened attention, not just to the music he was preparing but to the quality of the world around him. Festival days had always had a different texture for him. The air felt different. The colors were more pronounced. The sounds carried further and held longer than they normally did. He had learned over the years that this heightened state was worth paying attention to, that things revealed themselves at festival time that stayed hidden during the ordinary days. He did not know what would be revealed at this one. Agba spent the preparation days differently. Focused. Internally quiet in a way that the people who knew him well recognized as his pre-significant moment state. He had made a decision. He had spoken to his family. He had done everything that the tradition required him to do in preparation for what he was about to do. The gun had been cleaned and loaded. The words had been rehearsed inside him until they were no longer words but simply truth waiting to be released. He was ready. The morning of the festival arrived with the kind of beauty that seems almost designed, as if the day itself understands what is expected of it and dresses accordingly. Clear sky. Warm air carrying the smell of the forest and the river. The sound of the drums beginning before the sun was fully risen, calling the community together the way they had called communities together for generations. Uloko assembled. The elders came first, as was their right and their role, settling into their designated positions with the unhurried dignity of people who have learned that hurrying signals insecurity and they have nothing to be insecure about. The king came after, seated on the throne that had been carried to the festival ground, an act that transformed wherever the throne was placed into an extension of the palace, made wherever the king sat the center of the world. The women arrived in groups, dressed in the fabrics and colors of celebration, the oranges and reds and deep purples that Ayachu favored for its important days. The children ran between adult legs in the joyful, purposeless way of children who understand instinctively that this is a day when the normal rules are relaxed and the business of the day is simply to be alive and let that be enough. The warriors stood at the perimeter. Not as guards, the festival was not a place of threat, but as presence. As a reminder of the strength that protected what was being celebrated. Akbar stood among them. His posture was easy, his face calm. But there was something in the quality of his stillness that anyone who looked carefully might have recognized as anticipation. Ojika was near the center, where the musicians always gathered. He had already played 2 pieces that morning, a slow, contemplative opening that settled the assembly and then a building phrase that brought the energy up to the level appropriate for celebration. His flute was resting at his side now, his fingers still moving slightly as they often did when he was not playing, tracing the patterns of what he had just played, or what he was about to play, or what he was hearing inside that had not yet found its way out. His eyes moved across the gathered community with the habit of a musician who is always reading the room. And found Inori. She was standing with her mother and 2 younger women from neighboring compounds, dressed in the deep orange that suited her in ways she probably did not think about consciously because she was not the kind of woman who spent time thinking about what suited her. She was looking at the king's throne, at something the eldest elder was saying, her head tilted slightly with the quality of attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. And in that moment, in that completely ordinary moment of her simply standing and listening with her head tilted, Ojika understood something he had been slowly understanding for months. A last piece of a recognition that had been assembling itself piece by piece across all the times he had noticed her since the naming ceremony. He understood that the thing he felt was not the ordinary interest a man feels when he encounters a beautiful woman. It was deeper than that. It was the recognition of a particular kind of mind encountering another particular kind of mind and realizing, with the clarity of something genuinely understood rather than simply felt, that these 2 minds belonged in conversation with each other. Were built for conversation with each other. Would be diminished in isolation from each other. He understood this. And understanding it, he felt the weight of a decision arrive in his chest. He would declare himself. Today. At this festival. He would do what the tradition asked of him. He would speak in the language the tradition provided for exactly this, the gun raised toward the sky, the shot fired, the declaration made before witnesses in the way that declarations in Ayachu had always been made. He reached for his gun with steady hands. And on the other side of the festival ground, across the distance of all those gathered people and all that drumming and all that celebration, Akbar was reaching for his. The moment. A declaration at a festival in Ayachu does not happen without signal. There is a moment in the proceedings, known to everyone, recognized by everyone, when the space opens for such things. When the formal ceremonies have been completed and before the eating begins. A transitional space. A pause in the day's structure that functions like an open door. Both men felt it when it arrived. The drumming softened. The elders settled back in their positions. The king's posture shifted slightly, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a man prepared to witness something. The crowd, sensitized by years of attendance at festivals like this one, recognized the shift in atmosphere and quieted by degrees, not all at once but in the way that water settles, gradually, from the outside in. The space opened. Akbar moved first. Or maybe they moved simultaneously. This detail would be debated in Ayachu for years afterward, with different witnesses remembering it differently, each account shaped by where the person was standing and what they were watching at the precise moment. What everyone agreed on was that both men were in motion within the same breath of time. That both were walking toward the center of the festival ground. That both were holding their guns. Some people saw Akbar first. Some people saw Ojika first. Some people saw neither. They were looking at the king, or at the food being prepared at the edge of the ground, or at a child who had just fallen and was deciding whether to cry. They would learn what had happened from the people around them, and even then the telling would carry the particular distortion of events remembered through the emotion of their aftermath. But what no one who was watching disagreed on was this. Both men reached the center of the festival ground at the same time. Both raised their guns at the same time. Both looked toward Inori, across the distance of the gathered community, finding her face with the particular accuracy of people whose attention has been trained on a single point for long enough that they can locate it instantly regardless of the crowd around it. And both fired. The two shots were so close together that many people heard one sound with a strange quality to it, a doubling, an echo that arrived too soon to be an echo. Some heard it as a single shot muffled by something. Some heard it clearly as two. Others, those who were closest, who were not distracted by conversation or the movements of children, heard it exactly as it was. Two guns speaking at the same moment. One declaration made in two voices simultaneously. The sound rolled out across the festival ground and up into the air above the village and out toward the forest and the hills and the river. It rolled across all the faces of all the gathered people, across the elders who straightened in their seats with expressions of sudden sharp alertness, across the women who grabbed the children nearest to them in the instinctive protection of those who don't yet know what kind of danger has arrived, across the warriors at the perimeter who reached for weapons they did not ultimately draw, across the king whose face, that face trained by 31 years of ruling to reveal only what he chose to reveal, showed, for a fraction of a moment, something that might have been surprise. And then the sound settled. And the silence that came after it was the loudest silence Ayacho had ever produced. Both men stood in the center of the festival ground. Guns at their sides now, having done what they were raised to do. Facing each other across a distance of perhaps 4 arm lengths. Looking at each other with the expression of men who have just understood, simultaneously and with perfect clarity, the full scope of the situation they are now inside. Neither spoke. Not immediately. There was nothing to say that the moment had not already said more powerfully than words could. Then the noise came. Not organized noise. Not the noise of celebration or the noise of mourning, though elements of both were present. The noise of a community encountering something unprecedented and having no established response to it. The noise of 200 individual confusions arriving in the same space at the same moment and colliding with each other. People turned to the people beside them. Arguments began immediately, not between Akbar and Ojika, who were still standing in the silence they had created, but among the witnesses. About what had happened. About what it meant. About what should be done. About who had fired first. About whether it mattered who had fired first. About whether the tradition covered this. About what the tradition would say if it did. The elders stood up. Not all at once, but in a ripple, the way reeds bend in sequence when the wind passes through them. One elder, then the next, rising to the full authority of their standing, trying to establish order in the noise. And Inori. Inori, who had heard the shots from her position among the women, who had looked up from the conversation she had been half attending to and seen both men standing in the center of the ground with their guns, Inori stood very still. She did not reach for anyone's hand. She did not make a sound. She simply stood in the middle of all that noise and all that confusion and all those eyes that were now moving between the two men and her and the king and back again, and she breathed. She breathed with the deliberate steadiness of someone who understands that what is happening around them is going to require every resource they have, and that panicking is the quickest way to deplete those resources before they are needed. Above all the noise, above all the arguing and the confusion and the unprecedented quality of the moment, one voice cut through. The king's. He did not shout. Uloko had never needed to shout. His voice had a quality of authority that cut through noise the way a blade cuts through water, not by force but by the particular property of what it was made of. He said, "Enough." And the festival ground of Ayacho went quiet. The king's deliberation. What followed the silence was not immediate resolution. That would have been too simple for a situation this complex, and Obiis was not a man who reached for simple resolutions to complex situations. Simple resolutions to complex situations always left something unaddressed. And what was left unaddressed always returned, eventually, in a form more difficult than the original. He sat. He looked at both men. He looked at Inori. He looked at the elders. He looked at the gathered community, his people, his responsibility, looking back at him with the collective expression of a group that has encountered something outside its experience and is waiting for someone wiser than itself to tell it what to do. He asked for the senior elders to come to him. Not all of them, the 4 eldest, the ones whose memories stretched farthest back and whose collective experience represented the deepest reservoir of communal knowledge available. They came. They sat with him in the cluster of their combined authority. And they spoke, quietly, out of the hearing of the crowd, in the low urgent way of people addressing something genuinely difficult. The conversation lasted longer than anyone watching expected. The festival ground held its breath through it, the food growing less urgent, the children eventually settling beside their mothers and falling into the half-sleep of young things who have been overstimulated and are coming down from it. The drumming had stopped entirely. Even the forest at the edge of the ground seemed to have quieted, as if the trees too were waiting to hear what the king would decide. Agba stood to one side of the ground. He had not moved significantly since the shots were fired. He was present in the way he was always present, with that quality of complete physical ease that was deceptive to anyone who read ease as inattention. He was paying attention to everything. Processing everything. But doing it from a place of stillness that revealed nothing. Ojika stood on the other side. He had set his gun down, an early, instinctive act that some of the watching warriors noted and filed away, the way warriors always note and file the small decisions people make in moments of stress, because small decisions in moments of stress are always the most honest. He stood with his hands at his sides, his eyes moving between the king's deliberation and Inori and the faces of the people around him with the observant attentiveness of someone who processes the world through watching it. The 2 men had not spoken to each other. Had barely looked directly at each other since the moment in the center of the ground. Not out of hostility, the hostility would come later, or perhaps it would not come at all, or it would come in a form neither of them expected. But because what had happened between them in that moment was so large, so unprecedented, so completely outside the framework of everything either of them had prepared for, that looking at each other directly felt like touching something that was not yet ready to be touched. Eventually the king's deliberation with the elders reached a resting point. Not a conclusion, it was too early for a full conclusion. But a resting point. A position from which to speak to the community. Uloko rose. The ground attended. The ruling. He spoke for a long time. Longer than was typical even for him, whose rulings were never short because they were never simple. He spoke with the measured pace of a man who has always understood that the manner of delivering a judgment is almost as important as the judgment itself. The manner signals the quality of the thinking behind it. It signals respect for the people receiving it. It signals that what is being offered has been considered from every angle that wisdom can reach. He began with history. With the tradition of the Declaration, its origins in the community's founding stories, the purpose it served, the values it expressed. He spoke about why the tradition existed, not just what it was but why. Because in Ayacho, rules without their reasons were always more fragile than rules whose purposes were understood. A community that knows why it does something will sustain the practice through difficulty far better than a community that simply follows it as habit. He acknowledged what had happened with the full weight of its unprecedented nature. He did not minimize it. He did not call it a simple misunderstanding or an unfortunate coincidence. He called it what it was, an event for which no law in Ayachu's history had prepared them. An event that demanded new law to be made in response to it. He spoke about both men, about Agba, about Ojika, with the careful evenness of a man who understood that the community was watching how he treated each of them and that any perception of favor would corrode the legitimacy of whatever he decided. He acknowledged that both had acted in good faith. Both had followed the tradition as they understood it. Both had done exactly what the tradition asked them to do. Neither could be faulted for what had happened. And then he arrived at the heart of it. The custom, he said, speaks clearly when one gun fires. It has nothing to say when two fire simultaneously. And where the custom is silent, the king must speak. Not to override the custom, but to extend it. To fill the gap that the ancestors could not have anticipated when the custom was first established, because the ancestors were not omniscient and gaps were always inevitable and gaps were what kings were for. The gap would be filled, he said, by contest. He described it slowly, with each element specified, so that no one could later claim they had not understood. Both men would face each other in a formal contest, not a battle, not a war, not the kind of violence that draws blood and leaves one man unable to rise. But a contest of skill, of strength, of endurance. A meeting of what each man was made of, resolved in full view of the community, witnessed by elders and chiefs and ancestors who would be called upon to attend. The winner would marry Inori. The one who did not win would accept the outcome, publicly, completely, with the honor that his community expected of him, and he would not challenge the ruling or carry grievance against the outcome. This was not a suggestion. It was a condition. And the king made clear that the entire weight of his authority and the authority of every elder sitting beside him stood behind that condition. He looked at Agba. He looked at Ojika. He looked at Inori. He asked, in the formal way that required formal answers, whether each of the three people most directly affected by this ruling understood it and accepted it. Agba said yes. The word was short and contained. But it carried everything. Ojika said yes. His word had a different quality to it, not smaller, not less certain, but with something in the texture of it that spoke of a more complex inner landscape being navigated beneath the surface of the simple answer. Inori said yes. And in her voice, in the complete steadiness of it, the absolute refusal to allow it to waver or thin or carry anything that could be read as either hope or despair, the community heard something that made several of the older women press their lips together and look away briefly before looking back. The ruling was made. The matter was set. The festival would end and the preparations for the contest would begin. A date would be chosen by the elders in consultation with the king. The terms would be communicated to both families and to the community at large. The king sat back down. The festival ground exhaled. And the story moved into its next chapter. The families respond. In Ayachu, when something significant happens, it does not only affect the people immediately involved. It moves outward through the community's web of relationships like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples expanding until they reach every edge. The families of both men felt it before anyone came to tell them anything. Agba's household, his father Clement, his mother Mary, his two uncles who had helped raise him in the years after his father's illness had temporarily reduced the household, and the constellation of cousins and attached relatives who were part of their compound's extended life, received the news that evening when Agba came home. He sat with them in the main room of the compound and told them everything in the direct, unembellished manner that was his characteristic way of communicating important things. He reported facts. He reported the king's ruling. He told them what the contest would require and what its outcome would determine. His father listened without interrupting, a man who had learned that interrupting Agba was not a productive use of energy. When the account was complete, Clement sat with it for a long moment before speaking. Then he said what fathers of warriors in traditions like this have always said when their sons face significant challenges. He said that what was required was already present in the man sitting before him, and that the work now was not to acquire anything new but to make sure that what was already there was properly prepared and properly protected. His mother Mary said nothing for a long time. Then she stood up and went to the back of the compound where she kept certain things that had been passed to her by her own mother, and to her mother by hers, and she began the work of preparation that only mothers know how to do for sons who are about to face something that matters. The uncles talked about strategy, about what they knew of Ojika, about the nature of the contest and what it would demand and how Agbo's particular gifts measured against those demands. Their conversation was practical and focused, the conversation of men who loved the warrior-bred man in their family and wanted to help him think clearly rather than emotionally. Agbo listened to all of it, contributed to part of it. And then, when the conversation had reached its natural end, he went to his own room and sat alone in the darkness and did something that he had not done since childhood. He was afraid. Not of Ojika. Let that be clear. Not of the physical contest, which he assessed with the cold accuracy of his training and understood he had a significant advantage in. He was afraid of the weight of wanting something. Afraid of how much he wanted this particular outcome. Because he had learned in years of fighting that caring too much about winning was one of the surest ways to lose. That the clearest head in a contest was often the head with the least to lose. And he had a great deal to lose. He sat with that fear. He did not run from it or suppress it. He examined it the way you examine an injury, looking at what it is, where exactly it lives, what it tells you about the state of the thing it has found in you. And when he had looked at it long enough, he did what warriors are trained to do with fear: he converted it. Translated it. Changed its form from something that paralyzed into something that clarified. He would fight for Inori. But he would fight like a warrior, not like a man in love. Because the warrior wins. And then the man in love gets what the warrior has won. He held on to this. And eventually, he slept. Ojika's household received the news differently. He did not have a large compound. He lived with his aging father, his mother having died some years before, and two younger siblings who were still finding their way into adulthood. His father, the drummer, had the account of the festival with the particular quality of listening that musicians develop over lifetimes of attending to sound, patient, total, missing nothing. When Ojika finished, his father did not speak immediately. He picked up one of the small hand drums that always lived near him, the way tools live near craftsmen, constantly available, and he played something. Just a few bars. A phrase that Ojika recognized from his childhood, something his father had played in moments of significant transition for as long as he could remember. Then the old man set the drum down and looked at his son. He said, "You know who you are." That was all. 3 words. But Ojika had everything inside them. He heard his father saying that this contest would require Ojika to be completely, uncomplicatedly himself, not a version of himself that had borrowed anything from the warrior tradition he had not been raised in, not a performance of strength that was not his natural strength, but himself. Fully, without apology, without addition. His younger siblings were louder about their support, enthusiastic, worried, wanting to do something to help and not knowing what. Ojika managed them with the patient affection of an elder sibling who loves without being required by that love to pretend to certainties he does not have. That night he did not sleep quickly either. He lay in the dark and thought about Inori. Not the outcome. Not the contest. Not strategy or preparation. Just Inori. The face he had washed at the naming ceremony. The way she moved through the market. The sound her voice carried when she was talking about something she found genuinely interesting. He thought about what it would mean to spend a life in the presence of that. To have that face be the face he woke to. To have that voice be the voice that filled the rooms of his days. And then, because he was Ojika and his mind worked the way it worked, He thought about what it would mean if it did not happen. If the outcome went the other way. If Akbar won. He sat with this possibility with the honesty that was characteristic of him, unwilling to dress it in the comfortable fiction that he would be fine, but equally unwilling to collapse into the conclusion that he would not survive it. The truth, he decided, was somewhere more complicated and more real than either extreme. He would be changed by it. Profoundly changed. But he would still be himself. Still the person who had made that music at the naming ceremony. Still the person whose flute opened something in people that nothing else reached. Still himself. Even in loss. He held this. And eventually, he too slept. And Inori, in her compound across the village, did not sleep at all. She sat by the small window of her room and looked out at the night sky and talked to her mother's God, the particular version of the divine that her mother had taught her to trust, in the wordless language of genuine prayer. Not asking for a specific outcome. She was too honest with herself for that. But asking for something that felt both smaller and larger, asking to be seen, in whatever came next, as more than the object of a contest. Asking for whatever forces governed the lives of people like her to remember that she was a person. With a mind. With preferences. With the kind of inner life that deserved to matter to the outcome, even in a tradition that had not designed itself around her marching to it. She prayed this into the night. And waited for dawn. The preparation of warriors. The days between the king's ruling and the date of the contest were 10. 10 days is not a long time. But in the particular circumstances of this situation, with the weight of what it meant pressing down on every waking hour, with the village's attention focused on the two men and what they were doing with those hours, 10 days felt both too long and too short simultaneously. Akbar trained. He had always trained. Physical preparation was so deeply embedded in his daily life that the specific form it took was less important than the consistency of its presence. But for these 10 days the training had a different quality. More purposeful. More directed. He worked with his body the way a craftsman works with material they know intimately, not learning new things but refining things he already knew, bringing the existing tools to the highest possible edge. He ran in the mornings, not the casual runs of maintenance but the sustained hard runs that pushed his endurance to the places where it reported back information about itself that only extreme exertion produces. He worked on his wrestling, with his uncles, with two of the other village warriors who had agreed to help with preparation, focusing on the specific demands of the kind of contest the king had described. He slept carefully and ate carefully because he was a man who had been taught that a warrior's diet and rest are as much part of preparation as the physical work itself. He also, in the quieter moments of those 10 days, did something he did not tell his family about. He sat with the elders, not his own family's elders but two of the village's oldest surviving warriors, men whose fighting years were long behind them but whose memory of what it had felt like to face significant contests was still alive enough to be accessed. He sat with them and he asked questions. Not about technique. He had sufficient technique. He asked about the interior experience of the significant contest, what happened in the mind and the spirit when the stakes were personal rather than military. What changed when the thing you were fighting for was not a strategic objective but a human being you wanted to build a life with? The old warriors answered him with the directness of people who had survived enough to have no remaining patience for anything less than complete honesty. They told him things that were uncomfortable and useful. They told him about the way emotion interferes with instinct if you are not vigilant about the boundary between them. They told him about the fights they had won when they should have lost and the fights they had lost when they should have won, and in every story the variable that made the difference was not physical, it was mental. It was the quality of presence they had brought to the moment. Whether they had been entirely there or whether some part of them had been elsewhere, in the outcome they were hoping for, in the fear of the outcome they were dreading. Akbar listened. He stored everything. He brought it all into the interior space where he prepared the parts of himself that training could not reach. Ojika did not train in the conventional sense. He could not. His body was not built for conventional training, not for the kind that Akbar was doing, not in the time available. Attempting to become a warrior in 10 days would have been an act of profound self-delusion, and he was not a man given to delusions. He knew what he was. He knew what he was not. What Ojika did in those 10 days was something different. Something that the village watched with varying degrees of understanding, some seeing it as eccentric, some seeing it as avoidance, some, the ones who knew him best, seeing it as the most intelligent response possible to the situation he was in. He played. He played for hours each day. Not in the communal spaces, he took himself to the edge of the forest, to a place he had found years ago where a large smooth rock sat beside a narrow tributary of the Omi River, and the acoustics of the surrounding trees gave his playing a quality it did not have elsewhere. He sat on that rock and played the way he played when nobody was listening, without performance, without awareness of an audience, with nothing between him and the music but the air that his breath moved through the instrument. He played everything he knew. Every piece he had ever composed. Every traditional song he had ever learned. And then, and this was what his father understood when he learned about it later, he played new things. Things that had no name yet because they were being discovered in real time, in the 10 days before a contest whose outcome would determine the shape of the rest of his life. He was not avoiding preparation. He was preparing in the only way that made sense for who he was. Because Ojika had understood something in the days since the king's ruling, something that had arrived in him with the clarity of insight rather than the murky quality of wishful thinking. He understood that he could not beat Akbar in the domain where Akbar lived. Not with 10 days of preparation. Not with 100 days. Akbar was a warrior in the deepest, most complete sense, born to it, raised in it, built for it in ways that were not replicable. So Ojika was not preparing to become what he was not. He was preparing to be completely what he was, to bring to the contest the full force of the identity that had been his since birth. Not because he was certain this was enough. He was not certain. He held the possibility of his loss with the same honesty he had held it on the night of the ruling. But he was certain that it was the only genuine option available to him. A flute player pretending to be a warrior in order to win a warrior's contest was still just a flute player. And the thing he was bringing to this contest, whatever it was, whatever it would look like when the day arrived, had to be real or it was nothing. On the 7th day, he played something at the forest edge that made two birds go silent. He did not notice them going silent because he was inside the music. But he remembered it afterward, remembered the moment when the forest around him had gone very still in the way forests go still when something significant is happening and they are paying attention to it. He took it as a sign. He did not interpret the sign too specifically. He held it gently, the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet sure of. But he held it. And it helped. The night before the contest, the village of Ayachu could not sleep. Not collectively. Not all at once. But if you had walked through the compound paths in the deep hours of that night, the hours when the fires had died down to coals and the drums had been silent for hours and even the night birds were in the quieter part of their nocturnal conversations, you would have heard the sounds of wakefulness behind closed doors. Murmured conversations between husbands and wives. The particular silence of people lying with their eyes open in the dark, thinking. The story had taken hold of them. Stories like this always do, stories about people they know, about situations without precedent, about the kind of human drama that held a mirror up to things everyone understood from the inside even if they had never experienced them from the outside. Every woman in Ayachu who had ever had her future decided by forces outside her own control saw something of herself in Inori. Every man who had ever wanted something he could not simply take, who had been required to compete for it, to prove himself worthy of it, saw something of himself in one or both of the men preparing to face each other in the morning. The contest had become the community's story. Not just theirs. In Akbar's compound, a lamp burned late. His mother sat awake in the room that opened onto the compound's central space, not doing anything visible, not working or reading or performing any activity that could have been pointed to as the reason for her wakefulness. Simply sitting. Present with the night and with everything the night contained. When Akbar came out of his room in the hours before dawn, unable to sleep, following the instinct of warriors before significant engagements who know that the body sometimes serves better by moving than by lying still, he found her there. They looked at each other across the low space of the compound in the almost darkness. She did not say anything encouraging or profound. She had said everything there was to say in the days of preparation. What she did, what she had always done in the moments when words were insufficient, was reach out her hand. He took it. He sat beside her. Mother and warrior son, in the last hours of the night before the day that would change everything, holding on to each other in the simplest and most complete way available. After a time he squeezed her hand, released it, and went back to his room. He slept for 2 hours. It was enough. In Ojika's compound, his father was also awake. The old drummer sat in the compound's central space with a small drum in his lap, not playing it, just resting his palms against the skin of it in that gesture common among drummers of his generation, a kind of continuous communion with the instrument that was less about sound than about contact. Ojika came out once in the night. His father looked at him. Ojika looked back. Then Ojika did something unexpected. He picked up his flute from where he had left it at the edge of the doorway, sat across from his father, and played something very soft and very slow. Not performing. Just playing. The sound was barely above breath, meant for no one but the two of them and the night air and whatever else was present in that compound in those hours. His father listened with closed eyes. When Ojika finished, the old man nodded once, the specific nod of a musician who has heard something genuine and is confirming its genuineness without needing to add language to the confirmation. Ojika put the flute down, went back inside, and sat with the darkness until the first light began to suggest itself at the edge of the sky. And Inori. Inori, in her room, had her mother beside her. Adis, who had not been a young woman for a long time, who had seen enough of life to understand that most of what we fear does not consume us and most of what we hope for does not arrive in the exact form we imagined it would, sat with her daughter in the way of women who know that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer another person is simply your presence. Warm. Steady. Without demand. They did not talk much. What was there to say that had not already been understood between them? Adis understood her daughter's heart in the way that mothers who have paid attention understand. She knew what Inori felt without Inori having said it. And she knew that saying it out loud would serve no purpose beyond making both of them feel the weight of what could not be changed. So she sat. And Inori sat beside her. And the night moved through its final hours toward the dawn that was coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. The dawn came. And Ayacho rose with it. The gathering. The festival ground looked different in the light of the morning of the contest. The decorations from the harvest celebration were still present, the fabrics hung between posts, the arrangement of greenery at the perimeter, the configurations of color that had made the ground festive and bright 3 days before. But those same decorations, in this new context, had a different effect. The festivity had not disappeared but had been overlaid with something more serious. Like a face you know well that is carrying an expression you have not seen on it before. The community assembled with a different energy than it had assembled for the festival. Quieter. More deliberate. People took their positions with the awareness of people who understood that what they were about to witness was significant in a way that required them to be fully present for it, not as casual attendees but as witnesses whose presence had weight and whose witness had meaning. The elders came and took their places. All of them this time, not just the senior 4 but all of the recognized elders of Ayacho, present in their full number as a collective expression of the community's gravity about what was occurring. The king came last. His throne had been positioned at the optimal point of visibility, the place from which all of the contest ground could be seen without obstruction, from which his authority radiated outward in all directions to reach every corner of the assembled community. When Yuloko sat down and the formal acknowledgements had been made, the ground went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of people who have decided to give something their complete attention. A position had been arranged for Inori, visible, as the custom required, but also positioned with a degree of consideration for the human being who was not simply a symbol in this moment but a woman watching two men compete for the right to determine the direction of her life. She walked to that position with the quiet dignity she had been carrying through all of this, the dignity that was not performance but character, not chosen in this moment but built across years of being the specific person she was. People watched her walk. Several of the older women looked at her face and then looked away quickly, recognizing something in her expression that they did not want to examine too closely in the company of others. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She breathed. Then Agba entered. He came from the east side of the ground, the warrior's direction, by arrangement, because in Ayachu the east was the direction of strength and the directional associations of the tradition mattered in contexts like this. He wore the marks of his lineage's warrior tradition on his body, specific patterns that his family applied before significant engagements, that connected him to the warriors in his bloodline who had faced significant moments before him and whose strength he was asking to have available to him now. His work carried everything he was. The particular combination of complete physical ease and absolute readiness that had characterized him since boyhood. The contained quality of someone whose energy was not performing itself for an audience but was simply being directed at what needed to be directed at. When he entered the ground, a sound moved through the crowd, not quite a cheer, not quite a murmur, but something between them. The sound of a community acknowledging one of its own in a significant moment. Then Ojika entered. From the west side. He wore his own lineage's markings, different from Agba's, the marks of a family whose tradition was not warriors but something older, something the community held with a respect that was different in quality but not lesser in degree. He carried his flute at his side. This detail, unexpected, small, noticed immediately by everyone watching, created a second sound from the crowd. A sound that was unambiguously a murmur this time, moving from person to person across the assembled community as people noticed and registered and shared their noticing. He was not carrying it as a weapon. He was carrying it the way a person carries the thing that is most essentially theirs, the way the thing that tells the truth of who you are tends to stay near you when the moment requires you to be most yourself. The two men walked toward the center of the ground. They stopped at a distance that was close enough for each to see clearly the face of the other. Close enough to speak without shouting. They looked at each other for the first time directly since the moment of the Dua declaration, looked at each other with the full weight of everything that had accumulated in the days between. The preparations. The nights without sleep. The understanding of what this moment held and what its outcome would cost one of them. There was no hostility in that look. Let that be clear. Let that be precise. There was intensity, enormous, genuine intensity. There was competition in its most honest form, two people who both want the same thing and understand that only one of them can have it. There was even, in the complex human way of things, a form of mutual recognition, the kind that happens between people who are in the same extraordinary circumstance and understand each other's position from the inside because they are both inside it. But not hostility. They were not enemies. They were rivals. The distinction matters. The chief elder rose and spoke the terms of the contest one final time, speaking them aloud for the community to hear, making them collective knowledge and collective law rather than simply the ruling of one man. He described what would determine the outcome. He described what the outcome would mean. He described what was required of the man who did not win. When he finished, he looked at both men. Both men acknowledged what had been said. The chief elder stepped back. The king gave the signal. The contest began. The contest. The early minutes belonged to neither man. They circled each other with the careful attention of people who understand that in a contest with stakes this high, recklessness is the first and most fatal error. They were reading each other, gathering information, cataloging, assessing. Every movement was data. The way Agba held his center of gravity. The way Ojika moved his feet. The speed of each man's initial responses. The quality of their breathing. Agba's assessment of Ojika took less than a minute to form and was largely what he had expected, a man who moved with intelligence rather than force, who kept himself centered in a way that was not trained so much as natural, who was watching everything with the active observation of someone for whom watching is a primary skill. Not a conventional fighter. But not helpless either. Ojika's assessment of Agba took slightly longer, not because Agba was harder to read but because what Ojika was reading was not quite the same thing that Agba was reading. He was not cataloging fighting statistics. He was reading the person, the way Agba existed inside his body, the quality of his presence, the relationship between his physical capability and his interior state in this moment. What he saw was formidable. He had known it would be formidable. But knowing and seeing are different. He held what he saw without flinching from it. The first real exchange came when Agba moved, not recklessly, but with the decisive commitment of a warrior who has gathered enough information and is ready to begin acting on it. He moved with the efficiency of trained power, nothing wasted, everything directed, the kind of movement that looks almost slow until you realize it has arrived before you finish tracking it. Ojika moved. Not perfectly, he did not have the training to move perfectly in response to what Agba brought. But he moved with something that several of the watching warriors noted and remembered afterward. He moved with instinct. With the kind of response that comes not from a body trained to respond but from a mind that processes very fast and a body that has learned to trust the mind. He was hit. The exchange was not in his favor and he did not pretend otherwise to himself. But he was not destroyed by it. He absorbed and repositioned and found his feet again with a steadiness that was quieter and less dramatic than the crowd around him perhaps expected. The watching warriors exchanged glances. They had seen many things in many contests. They had not quite seen this thing. The contest continued. Agba pressed his advantage, because he was a warrior, and warriors press advantages. That is not cruelty or aggression for its own sake, it is the grammar of combat, the logic of a contest that is determined by something real rather than by negotiation or compromise. You press your advantage because your advantage is honest and because the framework of the contest asks you to be honest about what you are. And what Agba was this, stronger in the conventional measures, more trained, more experienced in the specific language of physical contest, more at home in this territory. Ojika kept getting back up. This is the thing that changed the quality of the contest as it progressed. Not his technique remained what it was, intelligent, instinctive, insufficient in raw comparison to what he was facing. But his capacity to absorb and return. His refusal to behave like a man who has decided the outcome. The quality of his presence in the face of a disadvantage that was visible to everyone watching. The crowd was responding to this in ways that contests usually do not produce. Usually a contest with a clear physical advantage on one side produces a crowd that begins to consolidate around the likely winner, the communal acknowledgement of evident superiority that is part of how contest works in a traditional community. The crowd was not fully consolidating. Something was keeping it divided. Something in what Ojika was doing, not doing well by the measures of conventional contest, but doing truly, was maintaining something in the crowd that pure physical dominance had not extinguished. At one point in the contest, somewhere in the middle period, when both men were carrying the evidence of what the engagement had caused them, Ojika did something that nobody expected, including, perhaps, Ojika himself. He played a single phrase. Brief. Not a performance, he was not performing. The flute that had stayed at his side throughout the contest was suddenly in his hands, and a phrase came out of it that was not music in the celebratory sense but something rawer than that, something that sounded like the inside of this moment. Like what this moment actually was, stripped of its surface and expressed in the language that Ojika knew better than any other. The sound stopped Agba. Not permanently, for only a moment. But it stopped him in the way that genuine surprise stops even the most disciplined warrior, in the way that an encounter with something entirely outside your preparation creates a pause before your training can reassert itself. A moment. But in a contest, a moment is everything and nothing simultaneously. Everything because moments are where contests turn. Nothing because a moment does not erase what came before it or guarantee what comes after it. The contest went on. The turning. Every contest has a turning point. Sometimes visible, sometimes invisible. Sometimes the crowd sees it at the moment it happens, and sometimes they only understand afterward, looking back, where exactly the hinge was that swung everything. The turning point of this contest was visible. It came not in a single dramatic exchange but in a sequence, a series of moments so close together that they functioned as one. Agba pressed. Ojika did not step back from the pressure, instead he moved in a direction that was diagonal to the expected response, a direction that the conventional grammar of combat would not have suggested, a direction that came from something other than fighting instinct. It came from music. Later, when Ojika tried to explain it to his father, he described it this way: he stopped thinking about the contest as a physical competition and started thinking about it as a piece of music. Music has rhythm. Music has call and response. Music has the phrase that you expect and then the unexpected note that resolves the phrase in a way more satisfying than the expected one. He found the unexpected note. He found it in his body, guided by a mind that had been trained across a lifetime not in the mechanics of fighting but in the architecture of sound and response and the discipline of listening to what is actually happening rather than what you expect to happen. The diagonal movement created a moment. Ojika used the moment. The specific thing he did in that moment was not something any of the watching warriors could have taught him in 10 days of training. It came from who he was. From the thing that could not be borrowed or replicated, only grown from the inside of a person across years of being genuinely themselves. Agba went down. Not permanently. Not without returning. But he went down in a way that changed the story of the contest, that moved the narrative from one of inevitable outcome towards something more open, more genuinely uncertain, more honest about the reality that a contest between two people who are both entirely themselves is never as predictable as it appears from the outside. He rose. Because Agba always rose. That was one of the fundamental things about him. But something had shifted. In the quality of the contest. In the information each man now had about the other. In the way the crowd was reading what it was seeing. And perhaps most importantly, in the interior landscape of each man himself. The contest entered its final phase. The finish. What ended it was not the dramatic final blow of stories told for entertainment. Real contests, the significant ones, the ones that matter, tend to end with something more complicated and more true. It ended when both men had given everything they had. When Agba had given the full force of everything his warrior's body and his warrior's training and his warrior's heart could generate, had given it without reservation, without holding anything back for later because there was no later anymore, there was only this, and found himself at a place his body did not often reach. The place where the well runs dry. He was still standing. He was not defeated in the way of a man who has been broken. He was at the edge of what he had to give. And the man across from him, the flute player, the musician, the unexpected thing in a warrior's contest, was also at that edge. Had been at that edge for longer than Agba had been operating from that depleted place for the later portions of the contest with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that empty is not the same as finished. They looked at each other across the last of the distance between them. Both breathing hard. both carrying the evidence of what the hours had cost them. Both entirely present in the moment in the way that only genuine physical exhaustion can make a person present, stripped of everything except the essential, reduced to the pure fact of themselves and what they are actually made of. And in that moment, in that exchange of looks between two men at the absolute limit of themselves, something was communicated that the crowd watching could feel even if they could not have put it into language. An acknowledgement of each other, of what this had been, of what both of them had brought to it and what that meant. The chief elder and the senior warriors who had been appointed to make the determination of the contest outcome had been watching with the trained precision of people assigned a specific responsibility. They had seen everything. They had tracked everything. Their assessment was not made in that final moment but had been forming across the full length of the contest, shaped by everything that had occurred from the first exchange to the last. The chief elder stepped forward. He raised his hand. He spoke. And Ayacho had its answer. The outcome and its reception. The name that the chief elder spoke fell across the festival ground like a stone into water. Ojika. The sound of it moved outward from the center of the ground to its edges and then beyond, to the people standing at the perimeter, to the children being held up by parents who wanted them to be able to say later that they were present, to the elders seated in their places, to the king on his throne, to Inori in her position, to Agba, standing in the center of the ground. The crowd's response was not unanimous celebration. It was the complex sound of a community processing an outcome that had not been universally expected, a sound that contained surprise, and emotion, and in some corners genuine grief, and in others something that was unmistakably relief, and in most places a kind of odd recognition that what they had witnessed had been something outside the ordinary categories their experience had prepared them for. Agba stood still. He stood still for a moment that lasted longer than the physical duration of a moment. The chief elder's words had arrived and he was inside them, fully inside them, in the specific way that a person is inside words that change everything. No performance of acceptance. No rush to demonstrate grace. Just a man taking in what had happened with the honesty that honesty requires. Then he breathed. One breath. Deep. The kind that reaches the bottom of the lungs. And he walked to Ojika. He walked across the distance between them, the physical distance and the other kind, and he stopped in front of the man who had beaten him. He looked at Ojika for a moment. Then he extended his hand. What Ojika felt in that moment, what it was to receive that hand from that man, from Agba of all people, the warrior born, the man for whom this loss was its own kind of extraordinary thing, Ojika would carry the feeling of it for the rest of his life without ever finding language adequate to describe it. He took the hand. He held it. He let it carry everything that hands can carry when words cannot. The king rose. He confirmed the outcome in the formal terms that the tradition required, speaking it into the community's record, making it permanent, making it law. He addressed Agba with the specific quality of honor that the situation called for, not consolation, which would have been diminishing, but recognition. Recognition of what Agba had brought to this contest and what that said about the man he was. He addressed Ojika with the recognition that the outcome warranted, and also with the weight of the responsibility that came with it. Because winning was not the end of anything. Winning was the beginning of the actual work. Then he looked toward Inori. And Inori, who had been sitting in her position through all of it, who had watched every exchange and held every emotion that the watching had produced and kept all of it within the container of her composure, Inori stood. She stood and looked at Ojika. And Ojika looked at her. And in that look, in that first look between them as people whose future was now, by the ruling of a king and the outcome of a contest and the strange doubling of a gun's voice on a festival day, joined, something was communicated that belonged only to them. What it was, precisely, is not a thing the story needs to say. Some things are private even inside a public story. Some things belong to the people they happen to and to no one else. What the village of Ayachu saw was a young woman and a young man looking at each other across the space that the world had created for them, and just beginning, the long, extraordinary, ordinary, difficult, beautiful work of seeing each other. That was enough. That was everything. The aftermath. In the days and weeks that followed, Ayachu processed what had happened the way communities always process significant events, through conversation. Through the retelling of the story in different configurations, each telling revealing different things depending on who was telling it and who was listening and what both brought to the exchange. Akbar did what he had promised he would do. He accepted the outcome with the honor of a warrior who understands that honor is most visibly itself in the moment when it costs the most. He did not withdraw from community life. He did not carry himself with the visible weight of grievance. He continued to be what he had always been, present, capable, the warrior that Ayachu relied on and would continue to rely on. He was not fine immediately. That would be too simple and too dishonest. There were mornings in the weeks following the contest when the first thing that arrived in his waking mind was Inori's face, and those mornings had a quality that he dealt with privately, without assistance from anyone, in the way of people who keep their most personal work to themselves. But he was himself. Consistently, genuinely himself. And eventually, not quickly, but eventually, the mornings were different. The face in his mind was replaced by other things. By the tasks of the day. By the ongoing life of a man who had much still to live and was not willing to leave it in the shadow of a single outcome, however significant. Ojika and Inori began their courtship in the formal way that the tradition required, with all the proper steps observed, all the necessary conversations had between families, all the rituals performed that marked the transition from contest outcome to genuine, legally and spiritually sanctioned union. What their private courtship was like, what it was to be Ojika learning to fully see and be seen by the woman he had watched for months from a distance, what it was to be Inori discovering that the man whose music had moved her was also, in the closer territory of genuine relationship, someone she could talk to in the specific way she had always wanted to be able to talk to someone. This was theirs. The public story had been public. This part was theirs. The king added to the law of Ayachu. Not at length, he was not a man who believed in lengthy legislation when clear and simple law would serve. He added a provision, properly formalized with the elders' consensus and the acknowledgement of the community, that addressed what should happen in the event that two guns were ever fired simultaneously again in declaration of a woman's hand. He did this not because he expected the situation to arise again. He did this because the gap had been found and the gap needed to be filled, so that whatever came next in Yukoro's history would not find the same absence of guidance that this moment had found. The community accepted the addition to its law. They absorbed it the way living things absorb what they need in order to continue, not dramatically, but thoroughly. And life in Ayachu went on. As it always did. As it always does. Full of the ordinary and the extraordinary woven together in the inseparable way of things that are actually real. What the story leaves behind. Stories end. The people in them do not end immediately, they continue for years beyond the final scene, carrying the story's events in their bodies and their memories and the patterns of their daily lives. But stories, as stories, end. This one ends here. But not without leaving something behind. Because the best traditional stories, the ones that survive the generations, that get told by firelight and repeated in new contexts and carried by communities through the changes that no community escapes, the best ones leave something behind that is more durable than the events that produced it. They leave a question. Or several questions. Held open. Available to anyone willing to sit with them. This story asks, what is a warrior? We entered it assuming we knew. We assumed that the warrior was the man born in the storm, trained in combat, proven on the battlefield. Akbar was all of this. He was the warrior in the conventional sense, completely and magnificently. But Ojika stood in a warrior's contest and was not destroyed. He was beaten by many of the conventional measures. But he was not destroyed. He found something in himself, a different kind of courage, a different kind of center, a refusal to become what he was not in order to survive what he was facing, that also deserves the name warrior. The story asks, what does a woman's life cost? Inori was not consulted about the contest. Her preferences were not formally solicited. The tradition moved around her and over her and produced an outcome that she was expected to accept. She accepted it with grace. But grace is not the same as absence of cost. The grace cost something. The acceptance cost something. The sitting in that position on the contest ground and watching two men determine her future, this cost her something that the story does not fully account for, and leaving it unaccounted for is its own kind of cost. These questions are not comfortable. They are not meant to be comfortable. They are meant to be honest. And honesty, in traditional storytelling as in everything else, is not always the same as comfort. The story asks, when the rules run out, when the tradition cannot cover what has happened, what do we do? Uloko answered this question by creating new law from the foundation of old values. He did not abandon the tradition. He extended it. He asked what the tradition was for, at its deepest level, what values it expressed, what purposes it served, and then he built something new from those values that could address the new situation. This is what wisdom does when it encounters the unprecedented. It does not panic and it does not improvise carelessly. It goes back to the foundation and builds from there. And the story asks, finally, the question that all love stories and all stories about wanting and loss and the gap between what we desire and what we receive ultimately ask. What do we do with the wanting that does not get what it wanted? Agbe wanted Inori. He wanted her with the full force of a man who has learned through years of controlled, disciplined living that when he wants something it is usually because the wanting is true. His wanting was true. And it did not get what it wanted. What do we do with that? The story does not answer this question tidily. It shows Agba extending his hand. It shows him choosing honor. It shows him continuing to be himself. And it trusts the audience to understand that this is not the resolution of the wanting, it is the management of it. The dignified, human, genuinely difficult management of desire that has been honestly held and honestly disappointed. There is no resolution for that kind of wanting except time and the ongoing fact of life. And even that is not resolution so much as it is continuation, the thing that keeps happening even when it does not resolve into something clean and complete. This is true. And traditional stories, at their best, are always true. Even when the truth is uncomfortable. Perhaps especially then. The gun spoke twice. One declaration made in two voices. One woman at the center of an ancient dilemma. Two men who were fully themselves in the facing of it. A king who found law in the gap where law had not yet been. A community that witnessed and grew from the witnessing. And somewhere in the village of Yukoro, after everything. A flute playing in the early morning hours. Soft. Private. True. The sound of a person alive in their own life. Making the music that was always only ever theirs to make. This is where the story lives. Not in the dramatic center of it, the shots and the contest and the judgment. But here. In this ordinary morning. In this private music. In the fact that life, having moved through the extraordinary, finds its way back to the ordinary and begins again. This is where all our stories live. In the mornings after. In the music that continues. In the ordinary, extraordinary, irreducible fact of being alive. If you enjoyed this, please share, comment and like. And don't forget to subscribe. See you in my next story.